Okay, I'm going to get going with this. I love Southern Hemisphere, the floras of Southern Hemisphere. Chris was talking about South Africa. I love New Zealand. Haven't been to Australia yet, but I want to go. And there's a lot more of South America I would love to see. But I did concentrate this one on actual hardy plants that we can grow, plants that we have growing here at the Arboretum, mostly plants that we've had growing here for quite a while. So let's see. All right. Now,
Looking good.
something that always that has stuck in my mind. Y'all remember the West Wing, probably, whether you watched it or not. You probably remember it. And there's a day, one of the episodes that they had, it was a day where people could come in and make a case for whatever their issue was. And one of the things was a group that came in and they wanted to start making, I'd start having maps and globes printed or flipped, what we would think upside down. The world is a round ball, and we think of, when you say north, people think up, and south down. I just did this to point out that that's kind of Euro northern hemisphere centric. When you look at that at a map, when you look at that on a globe, that kind of elevates the importance of the northern part of the world and tends to decrease the importance of the southern part of the world, which the southern hemisphere actually is much larger. And I think over the course of the coming many decades, it will just increase in importance in what they're doing there. And when you flip it, you really get a different sense of what the world looks like. South is warm to us, so we always think of warm, but it gets warmer, 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 cooler, 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 cooler as you go down. So if you think about South America in that sense, it's a much different kind of viewpoint than we have. Same thing with, it's a reason why we can grow some of the plants from South Africa. I can't see it there, but down here is because it's getting pretty far south, which is equivalent to our north, of course. So I'm going to start with bulbs. The bulbs and geophytes are probably the most widely grown South American plants that do well for us. And I did put the nativity of the plants, where they're from, on all of the slides. Or I shouldn't say that. One of our students put this together for me, which was a huge help. So shout out to Emma for doing this for me. But you're going to see this a lot. Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, some Paraguay, and some Chile. These are the areas that are farthest south. We think of Rio de Janeiro, very tropical. We think of Brazil, but as you get down to the south, the mountains get a little bit higher, and certainly Argentina gets all the way down. Tierra del Fuego gets to very inhospitable climate. There's actually, once all this clears up and we can travel again freely, I've got a tentative itinerary for a plant collecting trip through Uruguay, up in the low mountains, but kind of where Uruguay and Paraguay and Brazil all come together. So Hydranthus robustus may look fairly similar to some other plants you might be growing, or you might be growing these. It's closely related to the rain lilies, and often this is called a rain lily. Sometimes you see copper lily as well, not because of this plant, because other plants in the Hydranthus genus sometimes have these orangey, gold, red flowers that are kind of like copper. Hydranthus robustus is one of the most free flowering of these rain lilies. And they're called rain lilies because they often grow in drier climates, and when it rains, they flower, and then they'll stop flowering. They'll get more rain, and they flower. Well, we get lots of flowers here in the southeastern U.S. Lots of rain, so these stay flowering for a long, long period. There are some hybrids out there. There are some selections. Russell Manning is one that's a little bit deeper pink. You can see how these kind of pink at the tip and then get lighter, whereas the Russell Manning really stays pink throughout it. These have naturalized in some areas in the deep south. They're generally considered really hardy, more zone 8A, but in Raleigh here, where we are, where I am, we're kind of in the 8A to 7B kind of zone, and these are just fine here. I think they're probably a bit hardier than given credit for. Certainly a little bit hardier than Hebranthus robustus is this Hebranthus martinezii. It's a solid zone 7 plant. A little bit of a different color of pink, as you can see. Not quite as soft a pink, or maybe soft, but I don't know. There's something a little bit that makes this stand out to me. Some of the best forms have very distinct streaking in the petals, and there have been some that have been selected for that. Now, like I mentioned, both of these are bulbs, so they're generally propagated by either dividing the bulbs, and Hebranthus robustus really bulks up pretty quickly that way. Hebranthus martinezii, unfortunately, is much slower. You can also grow these out from seed, and most of the Hebranthus are pretty easy from seed, and they pop right up. They take a while, take a few years before they'll get to be flowering size. We have found that this species really likes very well-drained soil. It comes from some really hot, dry areas in the mountains of Argentina. And so it's perhaps a little more susceptible to winter wet, especially. But if you keep it a little drier, we have it in our scree garden. But if it's planted high or planted on a slope, lots of sun for both of these for best results. Another bulb that may be a little bit more familiar, Ipheion uniflorum, starflower. Again, this area, Uruguay, Chile, Argentina kind of area. And this is the typical form, really pale blue. It'll spread it offsets, which it offsets very quickly. It can also seed around a bit. It's beautiful in the spring, early spring when it flowers, kind of late winter, early spring. And then it'll kind of die back as it gets hotter, and then you start growing again as it cools off again and flower in the spring. It can be for some people over vigorous. Let's say it can spread pretty quickly. I think it's beautiful to get that early spring color, and it'll grow in part shade, full sun to part shade. So you can really kind of expand where you're growing your bulbs. Lots and lots of selections. Probably the most common selection, I didn't put a picture up, is Wisley Blue, which is maybe it's better in England where it was selected, but to me is just slightly darker than the species, a little bit more blue, a little bit less white in the center. But if I were going to grow a blue one, I would grow Rolf Fiedler or Jesse long before I'd grow that one. Great, a really vigorous white one, Albert Castillo. Froyle Mill is becoming more popular with this purpley blue, and Tessa is a good one. This to me is the slowest one to increase. So that can take a little bit longer. Or perhaps it's just where I have it planted. All really good, all great for early color. You can kind of see here it's got hellebores, these winter blooming hellebores flowering beside it, kind of just finishing up as they're in full bloom. Now, on the other end of the time spectrum from the Ipheion are the Rhodophyla, the oxblood lilies. This is the typical species, Rhodophyla bifida, and it grows across a wide range. And The hardiness really depends on where it's from. So be very careful if you're buying this. You either want to buy it from a nursery that's growing it in an area that experiences cold, or you want to make sure that where you are buying it from, they know where it comes from, because a lot of these bulbs, these South American bulbs, are grown, say, in Southern California and Texas, and just because you're getting Rhodophyla bifida doesn't mean you're getting a hardy form. So do be aware of that. And these are a little bit more tender. They're really kind of that 8A zone. Right, we're right at the edge for this, but they emerge in on bare stems pretty much in fall, and then the foliage comes up. You see foliage is starting to come up now. And the foliage will be there for a while, and they're kind of like small flowered amaryllis or the crinums or lycoris, the surprise lilies. They're but this really beautiful, shocking red. These are just finishing up for us here. Now, hardier than that is the very hard to find, or traditionally hard to find. It's getting a little bit easier. This variety, Spathacia, which is really beautiful, kind of rich, clear pink. This one flowers before the species. So this will come up, it'll flower, it'll really finish up, and then just the straight species, the red ones, will flower. And there are quite a few other species. They can be a little bit harder to come by. Some are hardy, some are not. So you may want to, do a little research before you buy them. If it come here and see things growing, or if you're not in this area, go to other botanic gardens. That's the best way to tell. And if somebody has a big clump like this, you can be pretty sure that it's been hardy for quite a while. A little clump maybe not so much, but these are easily zone 7 plants, so quite hardy. I get into a little more unusual types of things. If you look at this, you can probably tell this is an iris relative, and you certainly would be able to if you could see the foliage, which is kind of flat and pleated like you see in a lot of iris relatives. But it's sometimes called the blue goblet flower, and you can kind of see that it's cup shaped. It's hard to get a good picture of that. But really striking when people see these, they want to know what it is. You've got these blue outer sepals that kind of petals that kind of fold over, and then these smaller ones, which are really multicolored. You get the yellow and white and blue on the outside, and then in the inside, you always get some really neat speckling in there. Individual flowers last for a day, maybe a few days if we're getting some really cool weather. But they are produced just in abundance. They keep coming and coming and coming. So it'll flower really from midsummer on into late summer or early fall once you get it big enough and going, and it's really quite hardy. Happiest in a fairly well-drained soil. It doesn't need to be a rock garden or anything like that, but it doesn't want to sit in heavy soil. So you want it to be well amended. I usually recommend most of these South American bulbs really planting them in the spring and letting them really establish over the summer before they hit their first winter. Unlike some of the spring flowering bulbs that you would be planting now, which you can see next Wednesday when Doug talks about that. There are other species, and perhaps even easier than Cypellus colestris is Herbaceous, which is bright yellow, tends to have these narrower, more open petals, but again, that really interesting shape for a flower, that kind of triangular with a little cup in the middle and these speckles. Again, this one usually, the individual flowers usually last more than one day, but they are produced in abundance. They only last for a few days, but a big patch of this, and this is a long-lived plant. This is maybe this is the easiest Cypella I've grown. You get this really beautiful cluster of narrow fan-shaped foliage, and then tons and tons of these bright gold flowers. Really a beautiful little plant. And then these will go dormant during winter, like typical bulbs. Oops, I think I went over. Now, some herbaceous perennials. We as you go from bulbs to herbaceous perennials to shrubs and trees, we kind of grow fewer and fewer of those as we get here. The things that can go dormant in the winter are a little easier to grow. But this is one that people used to grow more, and they've kind of moved away from for some reason. Oops. It's hardy, probably to zone 5. It's exceptionally hardy. This is it's called the parrot flower, the variegated parrot flower. The solid green leaf one grows just the same, but you see it less often than this old variegated selection. So there are other alströmerias, which are more clumping forms, but this Alströmeria psittacina is really a spreading form. And here you see it in a very dry spot in full sun. This is it in full shade or pretty heavy shade. And I actually like it there. It would never have to flower for me, and I would think that was just fine. But when it does flower, it sends up these stalks with kind of few leaves, and then you get these red flowers with green tips and a little bit of white in there as well in this variegated form. And so really pretty. It won't flower quite as heavy in the shade, but as long as it's in part shade and gets some sun, it'll flower, and that looks especially nice against some dark green background like this, kind of washed out when you get into this kind of bright glaring sun. But I just think it's beautiful. Some people are like, oh my God, it spreads everywhere, I don't like it, because it will form a kind of a ground cover. In a very mild winter, it'll really stay pretty much evergreen. In a cold winter, it'll die back to the ground. You get into zone 6, zone 5, it'll definitely die back to the ground. But it's easy to pull out. Some things spread and are hard to pull out. Those I avoid, but the things that spread and are easy, in my mind, easy to get rid of, I like those, because you can knit all around things. If you have a spot that isn't doing so well, you can take some of this from one area of your garden and move it into another area, and it'll help fill that in until you figure out what you're going to do. So it's one of those good plants for just plugging in places and letting it take up some space. This may be a new species for a lot of you, Salvia caerulea, blue salvia. But if you know the plant Salvia granitica, this is the same thing. They just changed the name on it. The salvia people, the sage people, they love changing names on things. Rosemary is a sage now. It's no longer its own genus Rosmarinus. It's a salvia. So a fairly widespread species, beautiful big plants. They get to be 5, 6 feet tall if they're happy. They want full sun, good drainage, but if you give them water and they have good drainage, they'll get bigger and bigger. I like them to grow them a little bit on the lean side, a little bit on the dry side, because if they get too vigorous, they can flop a bit. But if they're a bit on the drier side, they'll stand right up. And so they're a good plant for where you do have floppy things around to grow nearby, so that it can kind of help support them. From midsummer on, you'll get these really nice purpley blue flowers and spikes above the foliage, and it'll keep flowering and flowering. If and you can see here that how it kind of keeps flowering up the spike and keeps going and going. If it gets to where you're not much is happening there, you go ahead and take the flower spike off down around the foliage, and it'll keep it looking tidy, but also flowering. Lots of selections. Van Remsen, Black and Bloom is one. Well, let me go back. Van Remsen's a fairly large flowered form with good color. Black and Bloom has a black calyx along with the flower, and you can see there was a green calyx here. Black and Bloom is a slightly more compact form of one that was called Black and Blue. To me, it isn't much different in size. I think it was it may be more or less the same thing that was renamed. There was early on when this started becoming more and more popular. There was one that looked just like this called Black and Blue, and somebody who will remain nameless put the common name of domestic violet sage on it, which 25 years ago people thought was a funny name for a plant that was called Black and Blue. Nowadays, people don't find that quite as funny, and I think maybe somebody renamed the same plant to get it away from that association. Just speculating. I don't know that for sure. But other ones, there's some really nice deep blue ones. Cosquin's one, there are others. And then another old popular one is Argentine Skies. This was a wild collected form, and you can see it's got these very pale blue flowers. Interesting because it's different, but to me, it reads from a distance, like if you were looking at it and this was Argentine Skies, to me, it reads as kind of a dirty white. Yeah, interesting because it's different. I don't know if it's the first one that I would choose. Eryngiums. I love Eryngiums. They're so great for texture and kind of being interesting. And there's so many Eryngiums down in southern Brazil and Uruguay and Argentina that are really hardy and really showy. This one's called the Burnet Eryngium because it has it looks like sanguisorba or burnet flowers on there. So actually, if you were just to show me this, I would think probably it was burnet until you got me a little bit closer. But it grows on these wiry stems. The base comes out in the spring with these really beautiful strappy powdery blue foliage. Some of the Eryngiums can be kind of vicious. Some are evergreen. Think like agave vicious, but this is one of the softer ones. Eryngium eburneum is one of the less user-friendly ones, and I think, but not as bad as some of them. There is actually one called Yuccafolium, which really has kind of sharp serrated foliage. This forms this 3 foot wide or so by 3 foot tall mound of really strappy foliage that's kind of sawtoothed. And we were real nice. This is our perennial border. We put it right there on the edge of the perennial border to catch people who are walking too close to the border and stepping on there. But this one will bite you if you get too close. But then midsummer, going into fall, it'll send up these flower spikes, which then become seed heads, and these grow 7 to 8 feet tall. This plant is definitely over my head. And for those of you who've only seen me on video screen, I am 6'5", so it's very tall if it's over me. But look for Eryngiums. They've got the foliage before they flower is great texture. They always have really interesting flowers, not necessarily traditionally showy flowers, but very sculptural, very architectural in the landscape. Some have a real silvery blue cast to them, really just unusual, when you compare them to things like daylilies and milkweeds and things like that. Now, moving into more plants for a little bit of shade, we have these. Most places will put them as Semia nematothodes. This is one called Evita, aptly named since it's from Argentina. The older name is Gloxinia. Some people still put them in as Gloxinia, but this is a hardy African violet relative. And we're finding more and more and more of these hardy African violet relatives. A lot of them, the ones from Asia, are little rosettes that grow kind of on shaded rocky surfaces that we're finding are great for us. We're really getting excited about these guys, and can't wait to get back in China and collect a whole bunch more. But in terms of garden plants, they don't hold a candle to something like this. There's another one called Little Red that's a little bit dwarfer, has really nice dark red-green, a reddish cast to the foliage, and the same real intense flower color like this. So Semia is hardy to zone 7B for sure, but it doesn't emerge from the ground until really pretty late in June. So it grows in shady spots, but this is a great plant to plant to kind of combine with some of the spring woodland ephemerals that are going dormant by June. And by the time this is really going, they've died all the way back to the ground. So things like our native bloodroots and thalictrums and our native Mayapples and, some of the bulbs and lungworts, which start looking a little shabby by late in the season, cyclamen, whatever. So they come up in June, have this really beautiful succulent foliage, and then really starting in, August or so, they start flowering, and they continue flowering pretty much until frost. I still have them going great at my house. Hummingbirds love them. So you get those late season hummingbirds. Really love these. It's best in some shade for us, but I do have a patch of this and Little Red in full sun, and the leaves can get a little crispy if we don't give it enough water. But if it gets regular water, it's just fine. But you can see it here growing with hostas and ferns and things in a shade garden, and it's doing great. And it will spread to form patches. But again, it's easy to pull up. Some of the close relatives like Syningias will often form a tuber underground. These form these little white, they almost look like grubs, about an inch and a half, maybe 2 inches long underground. So you can dig those up and move them around the garden. And this is another one like the Alstroemeria that I mentioned. I'm always taking bits and pieces of this and moving it around, because in a shade garden, who doesn't need some bright red color in late summer? So a lot of times things are looking a little tired, especially in the shade garden, and this really perks everything up. Another relative, which we're just trying out. I'm not 100% convinced that this is super hardy for us. We haven't had a really cold winter since we've been growing it, but it's this Semia perparescence. And Semia perparescence grows over a real broad area in South America. And there are really two forms of it out there. And a lot of experts think that there are probably multiple species of it. So the two forms that you can see grown is this regular form that has the green tip to the flower, and it has really just a plain green leaf for the most part. The other form has a darker tip to the flower, and these kind of purplish leaves with red hairs. John Boggin, who's one of the world experts on these Gloxinias and Gloxinia relatives, especially the garden forms and the South American forms, he crossed the two to develop those two forms, to develop ones with this green tip, which is showier, but also having these reddish hairs and purpley foliage. And the result was this purple prince, which is really one of the nicer ones. It does get tall. It can be a little bit floppy. It seems to want more sun to stay upright, but really needs a little bit of shade to grow at its best. So if you can get it in that perfect in between spot, great. Otherwise, just grow it around other plants that'll hold it up, because I really think it does better in the shade, and you'll get a little bit more hardiness under high shade during winter than you will otherwise. But these will die back to the ground as well. This is one, if you're a little bit colder than where we are, or just in general, but all of these are really easy plants to propagate. Most of them you can do it from just about leaf cuttings. But if you just take a little bit of stem that doesn't have flowers on it and stick it in some moist soil in a pot in a somewhat sunny window, it'll root, and you'll have a backup plant for next spring if you do lose your plant. Nicotiana, probably can figure out what that is from that name. This is tobacco. This is what the same genus as what the Durham and Central or much of North Carolina was founded on. That tobacco is Nicotiana tabacum, but there are several other hardy, showy tobaccos. So it's from Argentina and grows in really inhospitable, hot, dry spots in Argentina. This is actually a picture of it from the Arboretum's trip, where we took a bunch of folks, some of whom are on this video with us. We took a bunch of folks to northern Italy and southern France, kind of that Mediterranean Riviera area. And this was at a garden that we stopped at. It wasn't just growing kind of in that garden. This is right by the street, but if you turned around, there was an old wall like they only have in southern France. But in the cracks of that wall, there was this same flowering tobacco growing. And often they call this the tree tobacco. You can see it'll grow really a single trunk and grow as a tree if you live in Monaco or somewhere like that. It dies back to the ground for us in zone 7, but it's an even prettier plant when it does that. The one that we grow and what I really recommend people growing is this Salta Blues. Salta Blues has a really nice kind of blue cast to the leaf. You can see that some in the wild, but it varies. So Salta Blue has that bluer leaf, and then the same really, really lovely gold flower. And what's nice about it is if it dies back to the ground every year, you get, when it flushes out, you get multiple stems. And it takes it a few years before you get something like this, but it does become a really beautiful plant. And we grow it in our perennial border kind of towards the back, and it comes up, you have that beautiful foliage. And then by kind of late summer, it's really flowering its head off, although it really will start flowering even earlier than that. But as everything's coming up, it's really has an impressive presence because it's so kind of big, and the foliage gets larger and larger. And as you may know from some PSAs and things like that, nicotine is not good for you. It's not the nicotine and other substances in tobacco, not real good for you. So these plants stay really nice and clean. Deer don't eat them. You tend not to get insects eating them. I see some things around that says, be careful planting it out because it's highly poisonous. I raised 2 kids, and you know what's often hard to do? Get them to eat the vegetables that you're trying to serve them. The idea that there are a lot of kids going around eating vegetables out of straight, just picking leaves off of plants and eating them out in the garden is not really a big problem. And it's incredibly bitter. So anybody who did bite into any part of this would be spitting it out pretty darn quickly. So I wouldn't be overly concerned. And cats and dogs, the same. They're apparently smarter than people. If you talk to people, vets, and generally, and people who work at in poison control centers, they rarely get calls for either kids or animals eating a lot of plants. There's a lot of other things that kids get poisoned by that you have around your house, and more often with your animals, it's at least your indoor pet type animals. It's eating something they shouldn't eat that you would be eating because they want to eat what you're eating. That was a big statement, and I know we might have a vet on here. So, Mickey, if you're on this call, don't tell me how wrong I am in public. You can do that privately. Abutilons. These are in the hibiscus family, the Malvaceae family, but they're often called flowering maples because the leaves can resemble maples, depending on which one you're growing. I love Abutilons, and as we've gotten warmer and warmer over the past several years, our winter's been so mild, I've been planting a lot of Abutilons and having them survive and come back. At this point, I probably have, 6 or 8 different cultivars in my garden. I know that when we hit a cold winter, they're going to die, at least some of them. They're really zone 8A plants for the most part. Some not even that hardy. But this Abutilon megapotamicum is a little bit hardier. Now, I still wouldn't call this species perfectly hardy for us. But this cultivar, Little Imp, is rock solid for us. We have had it growing outside well over a decade, maybe even longer than that. I didn't go in and check, but we have had this thing forever. And what's more, in a fairly mild winter, it stays evergreen and keeps flowering. We have had this in flower 12 months of the year. If you look behind here, this little pink flower is Prunus mume. This is a pretty early flowering one, but Prunus mume flowers, some start as early as late December and they go through February or so, depending on which selection. I think when I pulled this picture, I pulled it first because it showed the full plant in flower. We have a lot of up close ones, but not as many in the full plant in flower. This was taken in either January or February. So, a cold winter kills it back to the ground, but then it sprouts back up. And this Little Imp is about 3 feet tall. And if you grow it for a decade, when it's in full leaf, it can be maybe 6 feet wide. You can keep it a lot smaller than that, but we've had it growing there for so long. And it takes a while to get that wide, especially if it gets killed back. When I grow it, if it's still looking good and flowering, I let it go and just let it keep flowering its head off. But when it starts warming up again, I will cut it back really hard, even if it's flowering, because I want fresh new foliage on there. And once it gets a little bit of bulk back up, it'll start flowering again with these yellow flowers coming out of red. Anisticus or something like that, something with N's and C's and things all together.
Mark, you were for just a moment. Can you repeat what you were saying for the last couple sentences?
Oh, I was saying it used to be acnistus or something like that, and it was something that shouldn't have C's and N's and A's and things all next to each other. I always have trouble figuring out how to pronounce it exactly. But sometimes this one's called blue angel's trumpets, and this is a relative of Brugmansia and Datura, the other angel's trumpet. So it's in the nightshade family, the Solanaceae family, which, while that has some of our food crops in there, like peppers and tomatoes, also has some very poisonous plants. And this is one of those poisonous plants as well. So if you have dumb dogs or kids, I guess be aware. Where it is completely hardy, it'll grow to be an 8, 10, 12 foot tall shrub. It can be kind of pruned into more of a tree. And from late summer on, it'll just flower its head off with these little angel's trumpets. Now, these are not like the big Brugmansia. These little trumpets are about 1.5 inches, 2 inches long, but it does a whole lot of them. This form called Lago Azul, which we have distributed some in the past just as good blue, which it was called before a name was actually applied to it, is surprisingly hardier than the typical species, which is a zone 9 plant. I have killed this plant in my home garden several times, but that's really when I planted a really small plant and planted it kind of late in the summer. Best thing, if you get a little plant from us, the best thing would be to grow it as a house plant for a year or two and get some size on it before you plant it out. And even if you're, kind of the Raleigh type climate, you may want to plant it somewhere where it gets some protection. We've got the one here that has been alive for, oh gosh, I don't know, probably a decade or more. We've got it planted in a fairly protected spot right in front of our education center. So it has some cold protection right there. And we were shocked when it came back the first winter. It popped back up, and it has come back through some very cold winters. And during some very mild winters, it has not died back to the ground. Now, it's never gotten bigger than a couple feet tall, but we do usually get some flowers on it. It's maybe for us not the showiest plant in the garden because it doesn't grow real robustly like this one. That's at the Chelsea Physic Garden in London. So it's got that heat island effect around it. But it is kind of a cool plant, and I really like it. And I'm going to have to grow one to a larger size myself so that I can get one at my house because it is something that I'd love to grow. Now, a little bit more widespread, but if you have not seen it before and you come across it growing in a garden here, a garden a little farther north, believe it or not, Denver Botanic Garden, which gets much colder than us, this hardy bird of paradise shrub, Caesalpinia gillisii. This is a plant that we have grown for years. We've distributed it several times. I grow it at my house. If I'm out working in my yard and it's this time of year when this is in flower, guaranteed people who are walking down to the end of my cul-de-sac will stop and ask me what it is, almost to the point where I feel like I should move it so they don't stop to talk with me as much. I got limited time to garden. I need to go. So it'll grow just fine in average garden soil. It wants sun, but the drier you keep it during the winter, the hardier it is. Zone 6 probably even, but perfectly hardy for us. It wants the sun, and it will kind of reach for it and flop over. So often you do have to just stake it a little bit. Most winters, even around here, it'll die back to the ground, but then it'll come back. And you can either choose to leave 1, 2, or 3 stems, or you can choose more. If you choose fewer stems, it will get taller in a season. It'll get 6 or 8 feet plus in a season. If you let it really grow with more stems down low, you'll get a lower, bushier plant. I actually, when mine wants to try and grow with one or two stems, I'll actually pretty early in the season, I'll cut all the stems that are up there pretty low, and so that they branch and they'll come up. And even when I do that, it'll begin flowering in late summer and continue on. It's still in full flower for me at my garden, and this. You can see the silvery blue. The light really has to do more with how bright the sun was, how good a day it was to take pictures. This is kind of more what I think of it. But isn't that cool? The female parts, the pistils kind of come out and go up, and the stamens hang down. And in a single flower, kind of when they all open at the same time, the male parts shed their pollen before the female parts are ready for pollen. So you often need multiple plants to get the timing right to get seed, or you can save a little bit of pollen just for a couple of days and then pollinate the next set of flowers that open up. And they're real easy from seed. It's a bean. It's in the bean family. But it's also not too terribly difficult from cuttings. Another plant in the bean family, Senna corymbosa, tons of Sennas, and sometimes they're classified as acacias, but most taxonomists now split them out. This one, Senna corymbosa, is one that we have grown for a long time, and this is it at its prettiest. It has even with absolute neglect, it seems to have just the cleanest, prettiest green foliage and season bright yellow flowers. Now, where we grow it at the Arboretum, it tends to sucker around a little bit, and you'll lose parts of it, and then the other parts, so it kind of moves around. I have a feeling this person spends a little bit more time with it and probably keeps those suckers away to keep the main original clump kind of healthy and blooming. But if you don't, it'll kind of pop up here and there throughout the bed and actually be really nice. We don't have it popping up in any of our lawn areas, so I think it's constrained that way, but doesn't seem to be seed. It seems to be it suckering out kind of far away. But that's late season, and look at you can see there's some mums and sages flowering, so you can tell how late that is in the season, and look how green and beautiful that is. Now, perhaps my favorite shrub from South America, I don't know, that kind of hurt to say. One of my favorite shrubs from South America is the pineapple guava. It's an evergreen shrub. We're about as far north as you can really take it. And even we can be a little bit iffy sometimes. Used to be that it was marginally hardy here, and we named actually a much hardier form we just call it NCSU hardy. But it's been really a long time since any form has really been damaged here. So they flower starting in late spring and through early summer, mostly, with these really beautiful flowers, kind of pale pink with really beautiful stamens and pistils, reproductive organs in there. And you can see how showy that is on a plant. They can be grown as a small tree. You see that more down south in Florida. Here we tend to grow them more as shrubs. In the best forms, they have really, the new growth especially has real silvery blue foliage. I just think this plant is to die for. Now here we rarely get ripe fruit, but if you go a little bit farther south or towards the coast, if it's a really nice hot summer and an extended fall, you'll get. So it's reminiscent of a guava. It's not true guava. And the fruit is delicious when it gets ripe. It has all those various, kind of tropical fruits. Everybody says this about these kind of subtropical fruits is they taste like banana and strawberry or something like that. And, yeah, sure, whatever. What's else is very cool about it is in a lot of forms, including our NCSU hardy, although as I'm growing some other selections, I'm finding it's not as true in all of them. But the petals, they're thick, waxy petals. And if you pluck the petals off, not the centers, but just the petals are really super sweet. And we have pictures of squirrels eating the flower petals. I think they learned that from us because we always show it on tours and show it to our interns, and our interns always come back and strip all the petals off of there. So I'm glad that the center parts are showy, because on our tree, this isn't our plant, our trees, as far up as the tallest intern can reach, all the flower petals disappear on there. We need donations for interns because we apparently don't pay them enough because they're having to eat all the flower petals off of our pineapple guavas. There's some variegated forms, a white-edged and a gold-edged form. My guess is they're not as hardy. I have not gotten my hands on them, but I know somebody who knows somebody, and we both know somebody who can graft them. So we're going to hopefully get some plants. In New Zealand, they grow a lot of these. And I was really excited the first time I was in New Zealand to go visit a nursery that this is one of their specialties is pineapple guava. And they have a bunch of different named varieties that they grow because this thing is a bear to propagate. It is so hard to get this thing rooted. And I asked them, what was their secret? And they said they didn't have a secret. They, they'd been, kind of doing the same thing as long as they were growing it. And it seemed to work fine. And so I went to look at what they were doing. And what I found out is, they propagate it just like we do. They stick, if they want, 10 to root, they stick 1,000 cuttings and get 10 of them. So it just, even for them, it roots in small numbers. It's something that I still want to work with because I think this is really a very good landscape plant. I think there's some selection that could be done. I think there's some breeding that could be done. We've got 3 or 4 named selections. I know where there's a whole bunch more, and I want to get every single one we can get, grow them out, test them for hardiness, see if there's some that start fruiting earlier where we could actually get fruit on them, not just the flower petals. See if there's some with better silvery blue foliage, just really, really check them out. I had a few friends in Texas, including Adam Black, who will be speaking to the Rock Garden Society, keeping an eye out for plants in Texas in the landscape that came through that polar vortex they had this past winter, that came through that in good shape. So really, if we get some that really survive that very well, those may be some that we want to stick a couple thousand cuttings so we can get a few plants of them. Now, on the easier side, then both to propagate and to really do well with is the Cestrum parkii. And there are several Cestrums. This is another one in that nightshade family. So we don't tend to have many problems with insects on it. These are probably the cleanest cannas in the garden because they're growing right next to this plant that kind of repels insects. This makes a big shrub with these beautiful yellow orange flowers. There are a couple that are out there as orange peel and lemon peel. I'm not sure if lemon peel is actually a real thing or not. Orange peel is, but I'm not sure if it's a whole lot different than the species or just seedlings that are different. There seems to be some confusion. I'd like to get all 3 types growing together and see if they are really all 3 the same thing. In a cold winter, this will die back to the ground. And as a young plant, it'll often die back to the ground, resprout, flower over an extended period. And then when it fruits, if it forms seed, they're little black, kind of a little bit smaller than a marble, that will be held in these big clusters on top that, again, not showy from a distance, but really cool up close. Now, if you just let it go and it doesn't die back, it can get to be a pretty big sucker. But all you need, you can just cut it back late winter every year, and it'll sprout up. And by late summer, mid to late summer, it'll start flowering again and just keep going and going and going. In my mind, it's a just kind of a no-brainer type plant. I'll get into the palms. I love palms. That's the only thing that would induce me to move into the deep south, is the ability to grow palms and cycads. And this is one that is pretty hardy, and you can see them around the Raleigh area, best in a fairly dry spot. It's funny, there are some that are out in kind of gas station island areas that are doing well. Buteas are certainly the hardiest genera of these feather-typed palms, and it is a tree palm, but does not grow nearly as fast as the palmetto palm or the windmill palms, which are what you commonly see in terms of tree palms in colder areas. It grows over a wide range in South America, and generally people don't know where their palms are coming from, and that's often because it is difficult to, you can't just bring in wild collected plants or seed of palms without real special permits, because palms and cycads and orchids can be a little bit tricky depending on the type and where it's from and whatnot. Now, you can bring in seed from commercial sources of palms, but often you don't know where they collected them. So the higher the elevation, the better off the plant is going to be for us, the more cold hardy it's going to be. There is another species that's encountered less often called Butea odorata. There are quite a few Butea species. Some we're still just finding out how hardy they are, like Eryaspatha. But Butea odorata overall is going to be a hardier palm. So if you're looking for one, that might be the way to go. Boy, I told Chris I was going to be short today, but on my time, but I'm going long. I got a couple more. Colletia, how bizarre is this? This thing should not be hardy, but we've been growing it outside since 2009. Basically doesn't have leaves. It's got stems that photosynthesize. Or modified leaves. They go into spines and then these little flowers, but it looks like something from underwater. It is spiny and mean, and there's a couple of these Colletias that we've been growing here, very surprisingly, and doing well. But it looks like a tropical houseplant. But get it in a really well-drained soil in a pretty warm, hot spot. It's proven hardier than we thought it would be. A couple of conifers, because I can't help it. They've got some really neat podocarpus. This is one that we have distributed quite a bit. It grows at high elevations, and it is incredibly endangered just due to habitat loss. So we've been sharing this around with folks, but we weren't sure if it was going to be hardy, and it has been just rock solid. In fact, it outgrew our lath house. We had to propagate it and rip it out of there because it was taking over the whole thing. It's a beautiful evergreen podocarp, very drought tolerant, but doesn't need to be in a droughty area. And then this Austrocedrus chilensis, I just put this in here because I think it's neat that there is this plant that is basically an arborvitae. We have arborvitaes in the U.S., they're in Asia, and then in South America as well. Different genera because they've evolved apart from each other, but in many ways kind of the same plant. And one or two vines to finish up. Hydrangea Semia. I think actually this is the only plant that's in our plant sale that's going on right now. This is a fairly tender evergreen hydrangea from Mexico all the way down into South America. Seen it growing all over the UK. This is it at Wisley. This flower, though, is from here in the US. It forms these big buds that open up into lace cap flowers, and it's evergreen. It's an evergreen vine. I've got one that's starting to grow up a pine tree, but often if you can grow it up a house side where there's some heat there, it gives it a little bit more hardiness. And then last one, Manettia, real cute little vine. This is it in a couple spots in the arboretum. We'll either give it a structure to climb up or let it climb up plants. That's how I grow it at home. I don't like it to grow up something too tall because you can see it'll flower on its way up, but then once it gets up to the top where it can really get the sun, it really concentrates its flowering on the top. There's a really good form called John Elsley, but this is for us is a herbaceous vine. So it will die completely back to the ground and then resprout and grow up, and it's in flower right now. So it will do that each year. Whew, that was a lot and went longer than I thought. For those who want to stay, we do have a special treat for you. Doug and Dennis are in the nursery, and they're going to show some of the plants that are still available in our plant sale that are really amazing.